The purpose of the Global CFO Council is to provide an educational and networking forum for senior financial executives in order to share best practices, discuss current financial issues, and to learn about current topics related to the performance of their jobs.
Senator Mel Martinez, it's my honor to be able to welcome you. Senator Mel Martinez is the chairman of the Southeast U.S. of Latin American at J.P. Morgan Chase. Before joining J.P. Morgan Chase, Senator Martinez represented the great state of Florida alongside Senator Biden, with whom he served in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Prior to this time in the Senate, Senator Martinez served as the 12th Secretary of the Housing and Urban Development Authority under President George W. Bush, where he was the first Cuban American to serve in a president cabinet. Welcome and thank you, sir.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I'm really a pleasure to be with the CFO Council. As part of J.P. Morgan for almost 10 years, it's been a delight to see our growth and development in the Southeast. And so, along with John, I'm delighted to be a part of your breakfast today. Virtual breakfast, that is. I look forward to the time when maybe I can return for a more in-person visit with the council. And let me just say, as a way of introduction, because I know we're going to be talking about the situation and events in Washington and around the world, but that we're living in very, very difficult and challenging times. The pandemic has only exacerbated what have been difficult moments going back now for many years, and the division that we see manifested in our country by our elections only makes governance more difficult, which creates anxiety, I know, in the business community. I talk to a lot of clients of our firm, and I hear the same kinds of things. What's going on in Washington? What can we expect? And so with that in mind, I look forward to having a conversation this morning, not only with you, Robert, but also with the members who will be asking the questions. So take it away and let's get started.
Well, I was born in Florida, and most of my family still lives in Florida. I've got aunts and uncles and cousins all over. And my mom told me if I mess this up, I'm not invited to Thanksgiving. So a little stressed, but I'm excited. Let's get into question number one that I have for this fireside chat. It's been roughly 60 days since President Biden's inauguration. Any thoughts on the Biden administration so far?
Well, I hate to go back over recent history that's so unpleasant to talk about, but, as someone who immigrated to the U.S. and who believes in our system of democracy and the peaceful transfer of power, the president, CEO Joe Biden, started under a little bit of a turbulent moment, and one that is regretful. But nonetheless, I think the strength of our democracy and the institutions of our democracy, I think, prevailed over what was a very turbulent moment. Nonetheless, we now need to focus on what is happening. I would say the most surprising thing to me, having known President Biden as a senator and also as vice president, is how very, very partisan most of the things he has done have been. While his appointments were conventional people that were fairly well rooted in governance, had worked in the Obama administration, which, by the way, is not unusual. Most people in my administration, in the Bush administration that I was a part of, had served in the prior Bush administration. It seems like, there's always a continuity within a party in terms of those who occupy some of the more elevated positions in the presidential cabinet. But beyond that, and beyond the executive orders, which are almost expected, Obama did a number of them, Trump undid them all, Biden did them again. Is unfortunate way that we're governing through executive orders, which is not the way our system was intended to be. But for those you expect to be partisan, I still think that the way the $1.2 trillion stimulus, by the way, that's tough to get done. That's a lot of money. People who talked about billions being a lot of money, has been left behind. But in any event, that was a very partisan exercise with really no effort to work in any way, in a conciliatory way, which a majority can do, but it does at their sufferance, because I think finding ways to knit together the ability to work together is a very important thing, particularly at the beginning days of an administration. We're now shifting to another phase, which will be infrastructure, and I think this will be a very important moment, but also a real opportunity for bipartisanship. So I don't want to get here on a long monologue, but I will say that it's been surprising how very partisan President tendencies. The second thing, the way I would say, in terms of a surprise beyond the partisanship, I remember hearing words from the president early in his administration, maybe within the first 3-4 days, about the border and about immigration, and on doing a lot of the things that President Trump had done. By the way, some of the things President Trump did in terms of some of that issue, I did not agree with, even as a Republican myself, which I guess in full disclosure I should say. But nonetheless, I that some of the things that President Biden said were essentially an invitation. And I remember remarking to those who listen to me these days, which is a small group, mostly my wife. Anyway, no longer being a senator, but anyway, my audience has shrunk. Maybe your mom still listens when I somehow made myself into the papers. But in any event, I just remember saying the first crisis of the Biden administration is going to be at the border, because the words he pronounced were so predictably an invitation that what's transpiring today it's really almost naive to have thought this wouldn't be the outcome. And honestly, I think it's creating a crisis for his presidency very early on. And I'm not sure how he, directs it in a different direction. I saw this morning where he had said yesterday in an interview that he was essentially saying, "Don't come." It's got to be a little more than that, but I think that's a good start in trying to solve the crisis, which essentially was viewed. Your administration policies will be totally different. This is the time to go. And what we're seeing today is the tip of the iceberg of what's coming. And so anyway, an unfortunate unforced error on my part, in my opinion, by the Biden administration that they're going to pay dearly for. Politically speaking, I think they'll pay dearly.
Senator Martinez, we've all been dealing with a global pandemic the past 15 months now. What do you think we can expect from the Biden administration in this post-pandemic world?
Well, I think you will see a continuation of this stimulative economic growth idea. I think President Biden would like to see a transformation of America's working class to something more sustainable and in a way in which they can feel a little better about their lot in life. And so I think you will see a continuation of the stimulative economic policies with an infrastructure bill. The complication with infrastructure, by the way, which has a lot of bipartisan support, back to the days that I was in Washington. I mean, I remember discussing with then Vice President Biden doing infrastructure for the good of our country. The problem with it is going to be that because we have spent so much over the past year, and in necessary ways because of the pandemic, and more particularly now with this very, very large stimulus bill that just passed, I think we're going to find the need and the necessity for anything that comes in the future to be paid for. And in order for there to be a pay for, guess what that means? It's got the T word involved. We're talking taxes. And, I know all of your folks in your membership are delighted to hear that there'll be tax changes. But anyhow, no, I mean, in more serious vein, I think that's going to be the complicating element, and that's going to be where the bipartisanship again will fracture, I'm going to predict. And so it brings another issue, which is essentially kind of in the room, which is the filibuster. At what point will the opposition to the filibuster breach from within the Democrat ranks? And, I'm a believer in the traditions of the Senate and the need for there to be a balance between the two houses, and the design for the Senate were always intended to be a more deliberate body, which require consensus. We're really in a difficult moment because as the filibuster goes, I don't think it's a good thing. I didn't think it was a good thing when Republicans were in the majority and people would file against Mitch McConnell. Why doesn't he do away with the filibuster? Well, guess what, pal? Because there is it today, and you're in the minority next. I might make a political footnote that where Republicans find themselves in the minority because of a very misspent month of December with the Georgia election that was pivotal, that should never have been lost, where we lost 2 Senate seats. I'm speaking as a partisan now. I'm, not just been speaking to Republicans, but it's clearly what occurred. If we had had a little situation in the days leading up to that January 5th runoff in Georgia, I think the Republicans would still be in control of the Senate, and it'd be a different day. But having lost the Senate and just have consequences, now the issue is whether the filibuster will hold. And every day you see more fraying signs that it may not hold.
You mentioned infrastructure, and there is some bipartisan support of that. There's also the Green New Deal. Any thought about with the Biden administration, which would come first? Do you think we'll try to get infrastructure, or do you think the priority will be the Green New Deal?
Don't forget that President Biden in the campaign, which doesn't always mean that it gets remembered when you're in governance, but in the campaign, he was very clear that he was not a subscriber to the Green New Deal. In other words, he was not totally for the ideas of the Green New Deal. I think what we can see will be more a shift towards infrastructure than the Green New Deal. I think all along, including in infrastructure, you'll see an emphasis on renewable energy as part of infrastructure. I think you'll see any number of things which will be, but I mean, no different than today in corporate America. We have e-buildings. I mean, if we're going to do a building, I mean, J.P. Morgan Chase is building an enormous high-rise in Midtown Manhattan, 270 Park Avenue, rebuilding our headquarters. And that is going to be the fabulous, environmentally appropriate building ever. So that will be the tenor of the infrastructure spend, always thinking of how we make our world more sustainable and all of that. But I don't think a Green New Deal as envisioned by Bernie Sanders, you will see the Democratic president endorse.
Any thoughts on the likelihood of a increased federal minimum wage?
I do think they'll make some progress on that. Florida passed a $15 minimum wage a year ago. It's being implemented over time, and it'll begin with $11, and it will graduate on up over, I think it's a 4 or 5 year period of time to the $15. I have a feeling that in the federal context, which is what Joe Manchin, senator from West Virginia, supports, is the same sort of in a graduated way. There are a number of Republicans that support an increase in the minimum wage. So this is something where there could be a little bit of a bipartisan moment if the more leaning Democrats concede that 15 doesn't have to be today, which is tough for some of them to do. So I think there could be a bit of a bridging by, again, graduating it over a period of time and beginning with something a little more modest. So that could take place. I think that's very possibly. The problem is that the legislative calendar gets busy, and you begin with infrastructure, and that's not going to be an overnight thing. That's going to take months. You got immigration also pending. It's a real problem because of the issues at the border, and making it, frankly, more difficult for bipartisan immigration solutions, but also crying out for some sort of a fix to the immigration system. So at some point, the calendar gets crowded, and then you know what comes next? Elections. So even though we just are, I know in South Carolina, you had to have been so sick of seeing my friend Lindsey Graham on TV telling you how great he was. Anyway, and it is going to be season again. So you frankly think of this current calendar year as the legislatively open year, next year as an election year again. It's a sad way that our system has gotten, but unfortunately, that's kind of what it is. And at some point, the calendar gets so crowded that there's just nothing else going to happen legislatively. Now, if the filibuster gets breached, and the Senator Manchin is under incredible pressure to hold on that, but not hold by others, and if that gets changed, then Katie bar the door. There could be a ton of legislation that gets passed on a very partisan basis.
Senator, I know you're an immigrant to the United States yourself and have a passionate authority on immigration reform. Do you see any specific immigration reform passing, say, in the next year, given that what you just keyed up for us at the beginning with some saying a crisis at the border? Any sense of urgency?
Well, let me say that I think it has become much more difficult. If I'd been talking to you in January, I would have said, yes, I think immigration reform is on the agenda. And by the way, that doesn't mean immigration reform. It doesn't mean that we don't have a serious look at our border and a security at our border, which is necessary for a sovereign country to have. It's really more about what happens to that 11 million that's here, to those young kids that are now called the dreamers, and should they have a reasonable path to a life in this country, since this is the only country they know that lived here all their lives. So some fixes to the system. I'll tell you something else that is very, very important, and people don't often think of this, but at the PhD, at the math and science level, we have a tremendous need for people that are trained in those very high skills. And a lot of them were graduating from our universities and are promptly sending out of the country back to where they came from. I mean, if we could keep some of that talent, it would be terrific for our country. Beyond that, if we could also entice people who've always been had a pull to come to a country to continue to come, give them a path to come here legally, I think that would just be terrific for our country. So it's about fixing a badly broken system. It would be great if we could get there, but it's never going to happen with the crisis and disorder at the border that we see today. So I feel like it really depends totally on how the Biden administration handles what become a very, very difficult hand they have at the border.
During the introduction, I mentioned that you served with President Biden on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. What do you think a foreign policy will look like under President Biden? Any particular notes on China or Europe or Latin America?
By the way, as a little historical note, that same Foreign Relations Committee where I served also had another president by the name of Barack Obama, who was he and I began at the same time, so we were the freshman senators sitting at the very back of the semicircular days, and got to ask our questions after everyone else had already bored the audience. Anyway, but I believe that President Biden will be a very conventional foreign policy president, more so than Obama, much more so than Trump. I think he will go back to trying to reestablish our alliances, particularly with the European Union and NATO, our traditional European allies. I believe he will continue, and it looks very much like this is what's occurring, his policy that President Trump began on China. Yesterday, our Secretary of State was in Tokyo and made some very direct and tough remarks about China's aggressive policies. And so I think that becomes almost a continuity in American foreign policy, which I'm delighted to see, because I think one of the things that has hurt our image abroad has been the on and off nature of the foreign policy we've seen in our country over the last several years. And so I think the continuity will be good. I believe we will continue to be tough on China. As it relates to Latin America, Latin America, as much as I am interested in it and, chair the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee on Foreign Relations, I believe that it is such an afterthought that only in a time of crisis do we pay attention to Latin America. That vacuum that we've allowed there has been filled by China. China now has a tremendous influence in Latin America. They have become a second trading partner to Latin America behind us, but a very, very close second. And so it's an area that I think we'll do well to pay attention to. We have a huge problem in the Cuba Venezuela axis, which continues to fester. I think beyond that, we have Brazil has done horribly with the pandemic. Jair Bolsonaro, their president, is not someone that Biden is going to connect with like he and Trump did. Argentina continues to be in economic crisis. So it's a region that really is in a bit of disarray and trouble. And what I would give to us is look out for China, because they are really, really tracking the region. It's too close to home for us to ignore much longer.
You mentioned the 2022. Wow, that is so close. Elections coming up. So we've got, I guess, 9 months until the commercials begin again.
Yeah, really.
Where do you see the Biden administration and positioning itself over the next 9 months to prepare for those elections? In anyone running for a re-election, that they'll champion particular legislation that's important to corporate offices, or do you think the Biden administration will try to identify key areas of legislation that'll be, I'll need these people to get reelected to pass this legislation? See anything like that sort of being held out as a carrot over the next 12 months?
Let me go back on the issue of taxes. I think it's important that we think about taxes, and I'm not sure it's in the context of reelection. But I know there's going to be, particularly to pay for infrastructure, there's going to be an effort to raise the corporate rate and possibly to also raise the personal rate at the highest levels of income. By that, I don't know how that gets defined, frankly, but it'll probably be in the, not that high category. The real question mark I have is what happens with the estate tax, and particularly with the estate tax as some of the provisions there sunset in the not too distant future. I'm not sure I'm clear on the date of sunset, but I think it's beyond the 2 years. So I think tax policy is going to be a really important thing to keep an eye on, particularly if the filibuster does not survive. And if they continue to play games with reconciliation, and particularly on tax policy. So I think that would be, I'm not sure the parliamentarian will let that happen, but I do think that it's possible that the filibuster might have a problem when it comes to that. So keep an eye on that. I'm giving that to your membership as something to follow as time goes on. I think that the midterm elections usually don't go well for the party in power. And I think particularly with some of the things that I'm already seeing in the hyper-partisan approach to some of these things, that I think a lot of Republicans are going to come home to roost. I particularly think, by the way, that the issue of immigration, which regretfully for me, as someone who would like to see some solutions, has become a real political football. And both sides use it for political advantage more than for a solution. Being a pure political guy like me now that I'm out of office, I would like to see more solution-oriented rhetoric rather than just partisan, making points kind of rhetoric, But I think immigration is going to be a hot political issue if they don't bring the border under control very soon. So I think the midterms will benefit Republicans because they do. Also because of something really important going on, which is called redistricting. Every 10 years, you have the opportunity to utilize the census to redistrict. And so because of that, we are going to see real potential for Republican states like the South Carolina legislature, particularly in a state like Florida, which is gaining 3 seats this go around. Those 3 seats will be carved in a way that will become Republican seats. And with a majority of only 5 the Democrats have in the House, I think you can see he leaves very well that in 2 years, or, the next election cycle in 22, that you could see the House flip to Republican. So Democrats' urgency is that they know the same thing I know, and they look at it as this is our moment. And if we don't get all this passed, then we'll miss our moment. And so I think that's going to be the push, particularly from the Democrat left in the next year.
Senator, we've mentioned the filibuster a couple of times. Would you mind defining that? I'm sure there's going to be some folks on the call that have heard it, but trying to understand the difference between that 60% and the normal necessary to pass legislation in the Senate.
If I were to take a minute and just give you a little bit of a civics lesson, we have a bicameral system, two chambers, the House and the Senate. But the Senate was always designed to be a little different than the House. It was not designed to be majority rule, covered rules of order. When you get to the Senate, you realize that everything you've ever learned about running a meeting and all of that. I used to be chairman of Orange County, mayor of Orange County in Florida, and I ran the county commission meetings. And, it's a completely different game because you have the Senate rules. And the Senate rules are peculiar, have always held that the minority had rights and that the majority couldn't just say, okay, 51-49, boom, done. And so it had a threshold of unanimity that it required in order for legislation to pass. And so in Washington, there's a tale about how, I think someone wise in that era said that the House was not tea, and then the Senate was the saucer when you pour the tea to cool it. And so the passage of the House was in the Senate. If you're in the majority, if you were a Republican 3 years ago, you'd be saying, oh my gosh, we're passing all this stuff in the House, and it's all going to die in the Senate. If you're a more liberal Democrat, right now you're saying, well, listen, we passed this amazing bill on elections, H.R. 1, which you may have heard about, and now it's going to die in the Senate. Well, that's sort of the way things are designed, is that in order for something to pass the Senate, it has to reach a certain consensus. And in the recent history, that consensus has felt to be 60 votes. So what does that mean? It means that any one senator can say, no, I don't agree. The Senate operates based on what's called unanimous consent. So in order for the Senate to go to any new piece of business, there has to be unanimous consent. Any one senator can deny that unanimity consent. And so now it's become a 60-vote rule. One of the things they're talking about doing is making it back to the Mr. Smith Goes to Washington scene in the movie where he for 2 days or whatever. And, in recent years, the show, I think Ted Cruz, who the word show and Ted go pretty closely hand in hand. And anyway, he stayed all night and read children's books and whatever. But in recent years, it's been understood that if you objected, then you didn't have to go to the Senate, take the floor, and hold the floor. They're talking now about bringing that back, where if you were going to have a filibuster, you would have to essentially be there all day, all night, with, taking turns. It'd be sort of like a relay race, you yield the floor to a friend who's going to continue the filibuster for you, and you go get a nap, a bathroom break, and then someone else comes and that kind of thing. So they're talking about creating that sort of environment. Press R to make it more difficult to continue filibustering. But I personally think it's important whether I'm in the majority or the minority. When you're in the majority, it's a pain. When you're in the minority, it's a saving. And it really requires there be consensus in legislation. And the most dramatic and radical legislation will never get through the Senate. And that's by design the way our founders fairly well thought that this system should operate. So it's not done for efficiency, but for there to create consensus. And in recent years, it's been so difficult to achieve. And I'm not here to tell you that I have a solution, but we need to get to a better place where we begin to work together a little better and somehow, compromise. Not in principle, but does not become a dirty word. We've got to have a compromise. Our system is designed for it, and without it, nothing gets done.
Senator, you mentioned Ted Cruz, so it made me think out to 2024. Any thoughts to who may rise within the Republican Party to be a part of the conversation at the next presidential election?
There's an old saying that they say, what does a senator see in the mirror when they get up in the morning? The future president. That wasn't true for me because I wasn't born in this country, so I could never have aspired to presidency. But anyway, it's really kind of an interesting truism. And so I think the field is beginning to get crowded. And a lot of what you see going on is the jockeying for that. Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley are trying to compete for the Trump lane. I think the presumption for most people is that Trump will not win. So they're trying to put themselves in position for it. That's a very interesting situation. Our governor, Ron DeSantis, views himself as presidential timber and is, I think, decidedly moving in that direction. But then you've got two Florida senators, Rubio and Scott, who also think of themselves as having presidential aspirations. So that's going to be really interesting. And then, of course, one of my real favorites is your former governor, Nikki Haley. I think that she's a tremendous potential and, managed to be in and out of the Trump administration without having a lot said about her on Twitter, which is, I think, a real victory. And so she's a very attractive candidate going forward. But I think beyond them, let's see, people talk about Romney. I really doubt that Senator Romney would do another run. I really and, there's a few others who maybe I'm thinking of at the moment, but those are the highlighters. I think certainly Florida's going to have a crowded primary if the three of them decide to run. And there'll be other. I think on the Democrat side, a lot of speculation whether Biden would run for another term or not, and I think that's well founded. I mean, the guy will be 82, and sometimes he looks okay, and then sometimes he looks a little frail. So I don't know. And on that score, by the way, I would just say that I would presume that Kamala Harris is the heir apparent, although she is the heir apparent. She didn't show the candidate when she ran 2 years ago. I mean, she really faltered in the primaries. So, and ambition, but it is. There's going to be some other Democrats who think themselves to be more presidential than she is. So that's the primary if Biden chose not to run again.
Senator, I'm going to
that's too early, man. Let's get through the pandemic. What do you think? Let's get back to the office.
Amen. Amen. Speaking of that, back in the office, if I put my CFO hat on, I'm seeing a lot of notes in the chat. You briefly touched on tax, and I know you don't have a crystal ball, but any thoughts on the corporate tax rate? You know, it's could be considered historically low. Is there a word on the street of what it might be? You know, to give us directional thought.
Look, number one, I think is on a bipartisan basis recognize that our tax rate previously was internationally uncompetitive. And I think even Democrats recognize that whatever they do, it has to keep our rates competitive in the world. And so what I hear is maybe 28%. So something in a little more beefed up 20s. If they're putting out 28, it may end up 26. I don't know, but it's going to be in that range. I don't think they want to take it back to where it was, and I don't recall exactly where it was, but I know it wasn't competitive. And so I think you can look for it to pop up 3-4 percentage points is what I think is where the talk is. It's nothing dramatic or anything like that. And I've also heard on the personal side that it might be above $400,000 in income. But, and by the way, tax policy is very complex to get through the Congress. And so any changes to the code are going to be few and far between. And consider how difficult it was to do what really Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell got done, now what, 5 years ago, or however long it was, which was very comprehensive and a big deal. Those don't happen very often. And with a very, very slim majority they have, I think that most they can do will be very much at the margins. I don't think any dramatic change. I'm thinking I worry about estate taxes and what may happen with that because of the sunset provisions that are there. So that's going to be something to keep an eye on as well. And by the way, if you want to hold the line on taxes, it makes it all the more important that in 2 years, Republicans take control of the House and potentially the Senate, but certainly the House is doable.
Well, I don't like that 28% number. That's a terrible number. That made me sad. I wrote an unhappy face next to that number.
Well, hopefully I'm overshooting it, but that's the number I've heard, and obviously that's going to be the number they put out if ultimately things do get compromised. But I've heard the 28 number.
Senator, you spoke briefly about foreign policy, mentioned China a little bit. Anything else to add to that? That peninsula seems to be both economically and militarily a hot spot in the news. Any further thoughts on China?
Well, look, I think that they have gone from being a country that we viewed benignly, that we sort of been helping, that we have policies that were very accommodating, particularly as we sought to bring them into the more democratic world. That project totally failed. There has been no evolution democratically in China. In fact, Xi Jinping has become more of an autocrat than even the prior presidents were. And I think the way they deal with their people internally and the human rights condition, the Uyghur population, things of that nature are anathema to what we believe as a country. So I think beyond that, the competition technologically and China's very, very aggressive posture, I think are really a danger going forward. And I think we need to pay very close attention to them. So I think whether it's the Huawei initiative, President Trump got this right, by the way. And I'm not always a fan, but he got this right. And I think that it's good that President Biden seems to be continuing the very tough policy. It's obvious. And one of the mistakes I think of the Trump year was that we shied away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was a trade, or as much as anything, also an alliance of like-minded countries, all of whom fear China, much more so than we do. We're talking Japan. We're talking South Korea. We're talking Australia. We're talking the Pacific region countries that are aligned with us, the Philippines, depending on what their politics are at the moment. But the South China Sea, the threat there, the threat to shipping lanes, the very aggressive posture electronically. In this morning's news, I saw an alliance between Russia and China in space. That is very, very dangerous. I mean, we are in a very dangerous world. And, which is why I think it's important for the United States to occupy a very special place we've occupied of leadership to the free world, because we are once again, unfortunately, in a competition. Maybe we're not in another Cold War, but by the way, I don't think we're looking at a very peaceful world like we saw immediately at the end of the Cold War. So I think the difference with China and Russia is they both are enemies. They both view us as competitors and would wish us to, not be the power that we are. China can make it happen more readily because of the economic power, the technological edge, the huge population. Where Russia basically, I've heard Bob Gates refer to them, the former Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense for Obama and Bush, and CIA director, and he refers to them as a glorified gas station. So basically, they're just an oil and gas producer, masquerading as a big power. Obviously, they're weapons, but they don't have the population, the economic wherewithal to really be a peer competitor across the board. They do have military power, but beyond that, where China has all of the above. And so I think that we need to really pay attention tremendously to that. I want to tell you, I don't know how widespread this is among consumers, but my wife sees something that says made in China on it. She puts it back in the rack and doesn't buy it. And I think increasingly you're going to see the need for there to be a shifting of resources, the manufacturing that has so often gone to China in recent years, diverting to other countries because of the people they represent. And I personally would love to see a lot of that. Obviously, Mexico has been a recipient of it. They lost it to China. They're getting it back from China. But I would love to see the Central American region also benefit from that, because frankly, that would be one of the answers to our immigration problems, is to create more employment and more opportunity for people south of the border. So that's a long answer. Maybe I don't need to over dramatize it, but I think my good friend, your Senator Lindsey Graham, would be 100% what I'm saying, and he is a real authority on foreign policy. So I do view this as being a fairly mainstream point of view these days in Washington, and not an isolated view. But anyway, I think the supply chains have got to evolve away from China to friendlier countries.
To pull the string on the Central and South America, Latin America region, where, in your role as the chairman of Southeast United States and Latin America, do you see opportunity in that region of the world as corporate professionals, and we're looking to expand? Are there particular countries or regions that you would recommend these are areas for opportunity to look for partnerships and corporate growth?
I think it's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. I mean, I think first of all you have to start with Mexico. I think Mexico begins there because Mexico has the free trade agreement, and already has a tremendous manufacturing edge, and in automobiles and so many other areas. But I think beyond them, I'm going to skip over Central America because I think it's such a troubled region, and I think there's opportunity there, but I think you'd have to be very careful. I'm going to go to sure bets, and I would say Colombia, and I would say Chile. are two very, very stable countries. Colombia has gone through a tremendous transformation, and for those of us who still think of Colombia as, oh my gosh, the Colombia cartels and all of that, Colombia is a very different place today than what it was 20 years ago. And it's thanks to a very courageous president, Alvaro Uribe, who essentially, and a very, very strong partnership with the United States, began by Clinton and continued by Bush, that brought about a real defeat to the guerrilla forces there, and essentially brought them to the peace table, where frankly they won some things they couldn't have won on the battlefield. But in any event, I guess that's what peace looks like. But today, I think there's a prosperous and stable and good climate for business. And I think Chile has been for a long time. Now, Colombia is a country of about 45 million people. Chile is a smaller country, 16, but also stable democracies both at this point. Stable for the region, very stable. And I think both have a very good climate. I think Argentina, by the way, if the politics is right, but if some other country that needs to be looked at carefully, because these are three countries where I think you would find a very good workforce, and where you would find a very, very strong business community, and places where I think you can do business. Brazil is more of an enigma, and I don't know it as well because I speak Spanish and not Portuguese. And while I visited there, just think right now we're going through a very convulsive moment politically. Not still at the moment, but I think those three are pretty safe ground, including Mexico, to do that.
We've got some notes in the chat box. We haven't covered Africa. I don't know if that's an area of expertise for you or your thoughts. China seems to be very interested in partnerships in that region. Clearly, it's a very large area with emerging economies. Any thoughts on the African continent?
My expertise doesn't go there too much, but I have to say that I think China is aggressively pursuing natural resources in Africa and Latin America both. And what they do is they're tying up a lot of resources, and they do it through loans that then become ownership, and that it really is a very threatening issue, I think. But I don't know the region as well. I think as you look at China, by the way, something I haven't touched on is the Silk Road Initiative that they began some years ago with a gigantic infrastructure bank to make loans to countries in a defined region, very important regions, and the traditional historic trade routes. And I think as you look at that and the threat that represents geopolitically is rather important. Interesting to that is that it's been ongoing now for a number of years. And a lot of those countries have very excitedly signed on to these infrastructure loans and now finding that China is not the U.S. and that they're not the benign friend and partner, and that they're now beginning to regret some of those alliances they made. And so, interesting how the world evolved in turn. So I would say cautiously optimistic that people will begin to get the picture, particularly if we provide an alternative. But I'll defer on Africa too much detail, honestly.
Senator, you mentioned the stimulus packages. We've had several of them, and the latest one being 1.9 trillion, which you mentioned it's staggering, right? That's $1,900 billion bills. It's staggering. Lots of comments and questions in the chat box around inflation. Thoughts on inflation? Has the J.P. Morgan Chase have a position? Anything that you're forecasting or seeing with inflation in the United States over the next, say, coming year?
Some people stay at a Holiday Inn for a night and consider themselves expert in certain matters. I've been at J.P. Morgan 10 years, but I will defer making economic forecast. Although I do think that I have read that the number one concern for investors has shifted from the pandemic to inflation. Unless the economic rules have changed, I think that any time you put this much money out from the Treasury into the economy, that the economy is going to overheat and then you're going to end up with inflation. I mean, I think it just stands to reason, right? I mean, your folks are smarter in this arena than I am because they're number crunchers. I'm just a BSer, a lawyer by training, so that'd be the worst thing to do. I serve on corporate boards, and I don't sit on audit committees with your CFOs. So anyhow, I do think that it's very hard to conceive how inflation doesn't kick in to a much higher level. I just hope it's not something that we are overcomplicating. What I've heard people express is smarter heads than mine on this issue is a combination of tremendous stimulative policies from the Fed and the government, and then combined with a return to the office, return to normal, return to travel. Last weekend was the largest travel weekend we've had in a year. So as the economy opens and the pent-up demand for spending and so forth, that kicks in addition to the stimulative spending, that could create a very volatile combination and mix. And so that is a concern, and I think it's a valid concern. I don't think that I have a crystal ball on that, but I do think that it's something that, without question, I think the rules of economics would tell us that that's going to happen.
I'm going to pull. I've got about 100, but I'm going to take 2 more questions because we're going to respect your time. First question is kind of back to a topic we covered in the middle around Republican senators. Some of them have announced that they're not going to seek re-election. Yeah. And is any thoughts on that? And who may fill some of those seats, or any particular Senate seats to keep an eye on as corporate citizens?
Well, that is a real problem. You got like 6 now, I think. Richard Shelby, Alabama, 86, 87. That's understandable, and that's a safe seat. Whole Alabama. I think you have to look at the state. I think a number of those are fairly safe seats and would not present a problem. But any open seats is an opportunity. The Georgia seats, who would have thought they were not safe seats? Of course, they were safe seats. Saxby Chambliss is a good friend. And he's a retired now senator from Georgia. And he kept telling me, no, we'll win these seats, Purdue in the first phase of the election had 49% of the vote and lost the runoff. How does that happen? So it really, there's nothing guaranteed, but I think a number of the retirements are in safe areas. Now, Pennsylvania's not. And Toomey retiring in Pennsylvania, he pick up for Democrat, frankly. So I think it's really a mixed situation yet, and a little too soon, frankly, to be making a forecast. But which is why I say that it would be an easier bet to suggest that we could pick. We, speaking as a Republican, but Republicans could pick up the House in 2 years. More difficult with the Senate changing hands. Although, there's an election in one of the 2 Georgia seats. That one could flip back. Warnock has to face re-election, as I believe is the one of the 2 seats. And if a good candidate jumps into the race, that could be turned the other way. One pickup, So you have to look around and see where the pickups might be. Marco Rubio is up for re-election in Florida. He should win the election, And so, it's a question of just where the opportunities are and where the seats are. So that picture hasn't quite settled yet. And then who's running for the replacement? So it's going to take a little bit of time before you can begin to see that picture come a little clearer. But I do think on the 22 election, the easiest would be to suggest the House with the Republicans.
Last question: any forecast or thoughts on Cuba opening back up for American travel and business? Had they either the Biden administration position or Cuba as a country acting in a maybe a more open and democratic nature?
Well, forecasting on Cuba is difficult. I left as a 15-year-old, and my dad says you'll be back in 3 months. He missed it by a little bit. Anyway, the nature of the regime has not shown any proclivity towards a more democratic opening. The opening that Obama did, which was very far and wide, did not receive any reciprocity from the Cuban government, which was very unfortunate and a missed opportunity in my view. And I think now Biden probably recognizing the realities of Florida electoral situation, it's going to be a little slower to. I don't think he'll repeat what Obama did. I don't think it'll be quite like that, because I think even Democrats understand that the reciprocity was not there. And so I believe that you'll see a much slower reopening to Cuba. There may be some steps, but not a full wide open. It makes me sad, by the way, to say this, but until Cuba changes the game, I talked to a number of business people, JP Morgan clients and others, when the Obama opening happened, who were looking to do business in Cuba. When you look at the rules of the game in Cuba, it does not factor in environment for foreign direct investment to be there. I mean, the government, this has to be your 51% partner. You cannot own property. You cannot hire directly. You have to hire through the government. You pay the government one wage. The employee gets a different wage. There's just so many rules of the game, and the deeper you get in it, you recognize that, too many places in the world to go, and it's just too complicated. It's got the bureaucracy of Russia without the oil and gas opportunity. And so, sadly, being so close, it would be great if things change. One good thing is that they're no longer Castro's running the show. The younger Castro, Raul, is in 90s now. And so I don't know too many 90-year-olds that wield a big political force. So maybe younger generations will come in. But it's a sad story. Makes me very sad. My kids are dying to go visit, but we can't go till it's different.
Well, Senator, this has been an honor to speak with you this morning. Personal pleasure. As I mentioned, my family's from Florida, and my grandfather immigrated to this country, and so my parents and my aunts and uncles were always very proud that you were representing the state. And so I think I did good enough to get invited to Thanksgiving, and I appreciate you for that.
Well, you tell them I say that you were a lot nicer to me than Meet the Press would have been, and so that you get to go to Thanksgiving dinner and enjoy Florida when you come. It's been a pleasure to be with all of you. And look, I think at times some of this conversation can sound a little dark, but let me just say that I'm a great American believer, and I think we have the most awesome country, the most awesome opportunities from a democratic standpoint, from a business standpoint. We're militarily secure. We are our own enemies within. We need to get our house in order. We need to come together as Americans, get our ducks in a row, put aside the partisan jersey, start wearing the red, white, and the blue, not the blue and the red, but the red, white, and the blue, and the stars all over it. Because, we're an awesome country, and if we can pull together as a nation, we can overcome our differences. The racial divisions, the issues that we've seen there. This is a country that can help provide opportunity to all. We need to make sure that we fulfill that promise, and that we are as good as our ideals and our founders put it on paper. So anyway, I hope it's not been a depressing conversation, although it can be at times, and I do look forward to an opportunity maybe to come back on a non-virtual basis and have coffee with you. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Everyone have a wonderful morning, and thank you, Senator Mel Martinez and the rest of the Chase JP Morgan team. I really appreciate it. Thank you all very much.
Thanks.